Migrating to Australia podcast and simulcast, isn't that how we used to say it in the 90s, boys? You would have had that up in 4ZZZ in Brisbane. Ashley Murphy.
Right, yep. I knew the station. I was more of a B105.
You're a B105. So you were going out to see the choir boys when I was going out to see the go-betweens in Spring Hill.
Well said. Exactly.
Yeah. All right, I'm Grant Williams. I'm the button pusher of this wonderful event we call Migrating to Australia. I speak all the time with David Bongiorno, Australia's leading migration agent, the migration titan. How are you, Grant? David?
How are you, mate? I'm good, mate. I'm coffeeed up and ready to go with Ashley and you. Looking forward to the chat.
Have you adapted to lockdown life now?
I'm shaving once a week still, so not much has changed. No, we're living in interesting times, and we've got an interesting guest today.
We have actually reached out to us a couple of weeks back, sent a comment in via the website, which is how we like it to happen. Ashley's a certified financial planner, and he's talking to us from the wilds of Minnesota. Have you been bear shooting lately, Ashley?
Bear shooting, yeah.
Or ice fishing. That's the other thing, isn't it?
That's the native Minnesotan winter pastime. No, I'm pleased to report, oh my goodness, it feels so good that winter's finally over. I went for a bike ride this week and I didn't have a balaclava on or ski goggles, so it was a winner.
Vikings winners, that's the thing. That's what most Australians think of Minnesota is the Viking.
That's right. So I was referring to cycling, but yeah, the Vikings, the Minnesota Vikings, they're NFL team. Their stadium is actually, about 6 blocks from where I am right now.
So now we've got 2 points of reference for Minnesota, Ashley and the Vikings. I love it.
and that's the state of lakes, isn't it, Ashley?
10,000 apparently. That's what they say. Right. It's everyone. It's funny, I've lived here now for 5.5 years, and it seems like everyone, and eventually you get to know them a bit, and they'll talk about going to their cabin by the lake. Everyone has a cabin by the lake, and it's possible because there are, in fact, 10,000 lakes, so it makes sense.
So, David, not all Australians associate Minnesota with the Vikings. Some of the crazy ones like me know that it's a bird-watching sensation because of all the lakes.
Interesting.
So you've got to remind people you're a birder, and you've made me become sort of a novice bird.
Yeah, well, me and 10 others, are really into the Minnesota bird watching.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, Grant. So my nanny, she's educated my 4-year-old and 2-year-old about birds, and so they can spot the breeds of these birds and name them and talk about, oh, that's the male, that's the female, and it just blows me away. So it's known for I guess the birds that migrate here as well.
Well, you can let them know about my other podcast that's called The Bird Emergency. I won't plug it anymore, but
no, free plug it's worth it. It's well worth a listen, Ashley.
Interesting. It's bloody fantastic.
All right.
Now, Ashley, you reached out to us because you know that there are some issues that a certain group of people migrating to Australia should be aware of.
That is correct. I had just been down in Melbourne at the beginning of March, and I had been at the Australian Law Council, or is it the Law Council of Australia, and their immigration conference, their annual immigration conference, seeing what that was all about and trying to get the word out. And I heard reference to David and Grant's fantastic show here, and that was what prompted the outreach. So there we have it. And mostly it was prompted by, the very unusual regime that Americans face.
Now, it is unusual, isn't it? Because it's citizenship-based taxation. Could you tell us the difference between, say, citizenship-based taxation and taxation of other countries?
Yeah. So the US is alone amongst developed countries. Eritrea is the only other country in the world. So in fine company.
Fine company.
That other bastion of democracy.
That's right. We don't want to say anything non-PC, though. So,
that's my job.
Okay. So the way it works is essentially best described by contrast with everywhere else that's not citizenship-based. So if you're an Aussie and you move to, anywhere, essentially, other than the US, and that's part of the answer to the question that I'm giving here, then Australia is going to say, if you're not working here, you're not living here, then other than the source of income, and that's the key concept here is source, we don't really see it appropriate to tax you. Now, if you have investment, real estate or trust income, the source of that is still considered to be Australian, but earned income or portfolio income is not. So if you're working in the UK, for instance, then the ATO is not going to have any interest in anything that you earn in the UK as a regular employee or on your portfolio, be it if that portfolio is still located in Australia or if it's in the UK. Whereas in the US, on the other hand, with citizenship-based taxation, it doesn't matter. As an American citizen, if you go to Antarctica, if you go to the moon, if you move to Australia, the UK, it doesn't matter. You are always subject to reporting and possibly also tax consequences. So it's a citizenship-based thing. When does it go away? Well, you would have to consider relinquishing citizenship if you wanted to make that go away.
That's a massive, massive call to relinquish citizenship. Actually, we, on the Migrating to Australia podcast and in practice, I never advocate, or very rarely advocate, renunciation of original citizenship. It's a massive call, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And it shocks me the gravity of those words when I say them. But I can tell you with absolute confidence that in the community of cross-border planners that I'm affiliated with, it's common for it to come up. I won't say advice necessarily because of the magnitude of the decision, but when you lay it out for someone and you say, here is the future for you, you are talking about permanent tax disadvantages and at a minimum administrative costs. And what I mean by the administrative costs is tax filings that would otherwise not be relevant.
So it's all about disadvantages and administrative costs. So you do the administration, but do you also help? Are there little angles, benefits in being a dual citizen that you can maybe tell or help US citizens based in Australia realise rather than doing tax themselves? Because in Australia, a lot of people do tax themselves. Is it the same stateside?
Yes, it is, but less so, given the complexity of the Internal Revenue Code. So in a nutshell, if I had the most simple explanation I could give to contrast the two countries would be rules-based versus principles-based. In Australia, it really follows, I think, a principle of fairness. You know, if something is fair, then and it's reasonable and it's not considered tax avoidance, then that's pretty much how the tax rulings would be determined. In the US, not that way at all. It's there's so many rules. You've got state level in New York City. You even have city level taxes, federal rules, and there are absolutely tax opportunities available with good planning in mind. But to get back to your question, I'd say there's probably two major advantages that US citizens have. One would be on the life insurance side, and that goes against the grain. I talk to Aussies all day long, and Aussies are like, absolutely, I'm going to get life insurance inside of my super. And I'd say, you can do that, and it's tax deductible. That's absolutely correct and true. However, it's also double or triple the price for the same amount of coverage compared with what it is in the US. You have to actually be physically present in the US to take your health exam and sign the app. So that's one thing. So, maybe that's something someone could do, if they're taking a trip back home. The other advantage I would point to, which is actually a disadvantage reframed, but it's the same disadvantage Australia has, and that is it's practically impossible, other than if you're working with a professional, but it's practically impossible to open a US account from Australia. So if you were an American, you can do it. My firm is able to do it. That's what we specialize in doing. But that American would also be able to do it if they were back home and then used mum's address or whatever. Then they could probably get it open. Then the advantage that conveys is that they would be able to invest using US investment products, which Morningstar, you've probably heard of the Chicago-based global investment research house, Morningstar. So every 2 years, they produce this global fund investor experience study. And it's where they have to control for a whole range of variables, of course, but they say if you had to be a managed fund or what's called mutual fund investor anywhere in the world, what would your experience be like? And Australia and the US perform at the top of that. The US is number one by a considerable margin on cost. But the US is not number one in every category. They rate across 4 different categories, one of which is the sales culture, another of which is the disclosures required, another is tax, and I forget that 4th category right now. But the US is far and away, it's about half the price just on the management expense fee compared with what you'd get in Australia. Now, that's with their median result. Can you find very inexpensive funds in Australia? Yes. You can even find free funds in the US. That's how the price war has gone here. But those would be, in a nutshell, I would say, life insurance and access to the US investment environment.
Hypothetical: a US family with an Australian wife, or let's say an Australian wife and an American husband. American husband migrates on a partner visa. When does the clock start ticking for obligations to the United States for IRS? And you mentioned reporting. That sort of sent a chill down my spine. It's like, if you don't report, there's consequences, yes?
Oh, yeah. Are there consequences? Absolutely. That's another one of the interesting cultural differences that I use with clients in describing Australia versus the US. I tend to think of Australian enforcement and rules as being like driving down the what's the name of that major highway that takes you out to the airport there in
Tullamarine Freeway.
Taking that freeway, Tullamarine Freeway. I remember hearing, must have been about 20 years ago, that they installed average speed timing. So it's basically, it is impossible to not get busted for speeding there. You are going to get caught because of the averaging thing. Anyway, that's maybe taking my analogy too far. But in Australia, the enforcement is there, and the penalties are fair. That's how I would characterize it. In the US, the enforcement is patchy and inconsistent, and the penalties are extremely stiff. Extremely stiff. So with regards to some of the tax reporting you're referring to, let's say with your FBAR, the Foreign Bank Account Reporting Act, if you don't disclose your bank accounts, your foreign bank accounts, with a US dollar adjusted balance greater than $10,000, and that's not one single bank account, that's all your bank accounts. If you've got more than 10 grand, you've got to disclose those accounts. And it gets better than that. You don't disclose that on your tax return. It's actually a completely different government department, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, that you have to make that disclosure to. And the penalties are up to, and I want to reference, my approach is not to instill fear in people, but it is important to know, what penalties you're up against. And there are stories that you'll hear about in industry publications of up to 50% of the asset value being, yes, 50% of the asset value for what's called willful non-compliance. And that's when they throw the book at you. But that's if the IRS can make a case that you willfully went about hiding that asset, not disclosing it, and then they find out about it. And that's the amount of sharing of information between governments is only increasing. There's the CRS, the Common Reporting Standards, where more and more financial and tax information is being shared amongst governments. And if that were to happen, that's the full extent of what the penalty could be for an FBAR violation.
IRS have got the resources to do that too, don't they?
They do. I remember a story when I first moved to the US. I moved for a year back in 1999, 2000, and a guy was saying that he was an owner of a gym. I was at the gym, and he said that he had a member, a regular patron of the gym, who had lived in Africa for an extended period of time. and I don't mean South Africa, in the middle of Cape Town or something. I mean removed, out the back of Burke kind of thing.
Off the grid.
Off the grid, and was tracked down by the IRS for their tax debt. Now, having said that, I do want to make you aware of exactly what the enforcement mechanisms are. And that is, with Australia, there really isn't an actual enforcement mechanism. So you might get a nasty gram, but they're not coming for you like Christopher Skase. They're not. So you don't have to move to Mallorca. So it's you could almost say it's a toothless tiger. But if you were to go back to the US, then there's no telling. And I'm not here to say what might happen to you, but enforcement action could include at the gate.
Tom Bradley detained at Tom Bradley International.
Tom Bradley, that's the one. Yep, exactly. So you could meet some lovely young officers from ICE there that might pull you aside and figure out a payment plan.
Wow. Grant, that terrifies me. I mean, you say you don't want to scare people, but often fear is a motivator, a focuser of intention. Now, what's the story for our hypothetical businessman? He moves to Brisbane, your old hometown.
Yep.
Raises a family, so he's got reporting obligations. What is the financial year in the United States? Is it a different financial time period than the time here?
Isn't it?
Well, yes, Grant. So the tax due date normally, if there isn't a global pandemic in effect, normally it's April 15th. But conveniently, the US actually follows the financial year follows the calendar year, so it's really simple like that. It's therefore it kind of feels like death by 1,000 lashes, to that businessman you're talking about, because just as soon as he's finished filling out his Aussie tax return, just a few months later, he's back on the job, looking at another tax return, and it never stops.
Double taxation a problem for those who are not au fait with the systems if they do it themselves?
It's a good question. I think it's a possibility. It's unlikely. I mean, there is a tax treaty that works to prevent a lot of that. And the thing with the US, sorry, David, for the diatribe, but it's worth stating that in the US, a lot of people, a lot of foreigners, let's think Aussies in particular, they say, I love that the US has a low tax environment, low taxes here. And that's the thing, is there's a cue. The cue to the answer to that question is actually in the word taxes. In Australia, when everyone talks about their tax, they say, my bloody tax bill, or this, I've got to pay a tax, whatever. It's really just a reference to the federal tax, and then the tax gets divvied up at the federal level, passed down to the states, and that's someone else's problem. It's some other bureaucratic department that handles that. But in the US, you actually really do have multiple tax returns to file, particularly if you're a US resident. As a non-resident, it could get tricky depending on what property you have and the source of that income. But it's important to note that the states are very aggressive about enforcing residency requirements. So keep in mind, the tax treaty is between the sovereign government. It's between the Australian government and the United States of America. It's not the tax treaty is not between Australia and the state of California or the state of New York. So that's another gotcha that you need to watch out for, a cherry bomb, as they like to say here. And that is, if you're not clear about relinquishing your state residency, then Gavin Newsom or I forget the governor of New York. He's on the tip of my tongue. He's been in the
Cuomo.
Mario Cuomo.
Mario Cuomo. He'll be reaching out and he'll be asking for his state tax. So that's another thing to be mindful of. But anyway, getting back to your point, is it possible? Yes, it's possible. Generally doesn't happen so much because you pay given that Australia has a higher federal tax rate than what the US does for practically every income bracket, you're going to be paying more tax here, in which case it's going to extinguish your obligation in the US on earned income. Okay. And in the US, they're very specific about different types of income. Earned income, passive income is what income from your portfolio or from your investments would be called. So yeah, different tax system altogether. I might just keep thinking about that one though, David, and come back to you if I have some more thoughts on that. Sorry.
I've got a thought on that, Ashley. I would think that it might not be the taxpayer who gets diddled. I'm guessing that it's going to be Australia that gets diddled. I'm thinking that the Americans will collect what they want to and need to, and then we give a tax credit for what has been paid internationally, and that somebody living in Australia using Australian services, maintaining dual citizenship in America, is probably paying less tax to Australia than the fella living next door with the exact same job.
That would be correct insofar as the US is, the only developed country with the citizenship-based taxation right there. So that's going to apply to any pairwise combination of, Americans going anywhere. Australia's pretty savvy, though. Like you see it and David, this is more up your alley than mine, but you see it with temporary residents coming in. They still get hit with super, and on the way out, that departing Australia super payment, Australia doesn't miss them. They take the tax out of their hide. And then the other answer is a broader answer again, and that is, I tend to look at the way that the world is structured and, from a post-World War II basis. And when you think about it, who won World War II? Who was the leading military? And I'm a big supporter of the Allies, but it was the US. It was the US. Why do I bring that up? Seemingly has nothing to do with nothing, right? But it does. It's the tax treaties with the US. Do you think Australia drafted that and said, hey, Reagan, would you sign this, please? It's got all our T's and C's in here. You just go along with it. No. The US, you can have...
Well, I mean, Pax Americana is a thing.
Yeah, and so the US have got a template tax treaty. Of course, each one is slightly different, but there's a clause in there called the savings clause. And what the savings clause dictates is that if you're an American, we can just forget that anything that might have given you a tax advantage doesn't apply. So we're going to tax you. It's the clause that dictates the global taxation structure. It's called the savings clause. So is the American paying a lower amount of tax? No, actually, the American in Australia is in a pretty uniquely disadvantaged position, mostly from super, actually, because super is not recognized as a qualified foreign retirement system. And so the way the IRS treats it is they say this is some abusive, or that's what's in the back of their mind, this might be an abusive foreign trust. And so depending on a range of factors, depending on who's made the majority of the contributions, the control of the super fund, the tax consequences of the super fund could be very bad for the American. And it really puts them in a difficult position, which is you're probably now beginning to piece together the tidbits here, David and Grant, as to why this community brings up relinquishment.
I've had half a dozen in 14 years, Ashley. I've had half a dozen Americans say the moment they get the Australian passport, they say that's it, we're done.
Yeah.
I mean that may seem to somebody not many, but it's actually big. It's a big call. It's a massive call.
And tell me, how does that compare, say, with people from other developed, say, European countries?
Those who can be dual, say, I've never had a Singaporean, a Malaysian, a Japanese, or a Korean client ever renounce their citizenship,
really?
And they never will. And I strongly advise they do not.
Yeah.
Because it's that their countries only recognise single citizenship, PR in perpetuity, but. I've had one Singaporean, actually, because he had nothing to gain by being a Singaporean. These half dozen Americans, once they've got their Australian passport, have been super fast in renouncing US citizenship, almost like get one, renounce the other, because of what you're talking about today. It is very complex.
And that's the thing, is that I am patriotic and grateful to, the opportunities that I've been afforded in the US, but they've also created a system that is just hugely unfair to expats. And there's no political representation for expats. There's something like, I just read today, as a matter of fact, there's something like 500,000 Americans living overseas, doing whatever they're doing. And they're all subject to this in different forms, works differently in different countries, but they're all subject to the same thing. And you can imagine with the political divide that exists in this country, the commentary that I hear from informed sources that follow the politicians, they say there is no appetite to be dealing with legislation that might remedy some of the worst of these effects.
I would have thought there'd be a movement somewhere trying to fight it.
There is, in fact. There's a lady, a hero of mine, Dr. Karen Alpert, is a lady up in Brisbane, Coincidentally, she happens to be a professor at my alma mater at University of Queensland. So she used to be a CPA in the US and then moved to Australia and is now just a business professor, but she's got a very, very deep insights into all of these matters. She runs an organization called fixthetreaty.org, and it's on Facebook, and you can find her. She's got a website as well. And she's done a great job, and the community that she's built has done a great job to document many of these inequities that we're talking about.
It's interesting. I mean, Grant, we don't have anything like that to consider as Aussie citizens. Our hypothetical US businessman, how does he use your services? How does he? I mean, what I'm hearing today is that you do a lot of harm minimisation, a lot of prophylactic measures. What are some of the benefits that engaging with you, Ashley? What are some of the benefits that you can seek for a citizen of both countries or permanent resident in Australia who is a US citizen? How can you give them an advantage they wouldn't get if they lodged their own tax return?
Yeah, and the way I'd answer that is I've spent the last 10 years and tens of thousands of dollars and hours developing this expertise. So I'm connected to Australian financial planners, Australian CPAs and other tax accountants familiar with all of these issues. So when I'm approached by a prospective client, as happened just last week, as a matter of fact, a gentleman saw one of my webinars on YouTube, and he reached out and he said, "Great, you're an Aussie and you're licensed in the US." And the first thing I said to him is, "I don't think that I'm going to be the best financial planner for you if you're living in Australia and you see yourself staying there for the long term. But what I can do is make a referral to the financial planner that and planners, plural, that I believe in." He happened by chance to live in Brisbane. So I said, my best friend asked me 5 years ago for a referral, and it took me 4 years, as they say, kissing a lot of frogs, meeting a lot of financial planners and so forth, before I found a guy who I thought was just fantastic. I really liked his approach. And so I was able to make an introduction. So that would be the first point, a network of providers specialized in dealing with these problems, the people that know the problems to begin with, because financial planners are a lot like there's a term, maybe you've heard of this, David, maybe not. In the US, there's a derogatory thing said about lawyers that practice any kind of law. They call them they practice door law. Door law. Any kind of law that walks through the door. So if it's estate planning, if it's a criminal matter, if it's a whatever, hey, there's dollar signs attached to giving that advice. I'm just going to run with it. And I think that's rife in financial planning, particularly in the US. I think Australia has come a long, long, long way. And so does Morningstar. They agree with me on the sales culture. Australia's number one in the world for financial advisor regulation. And I was just at a conference. I was a keynote speaker at the FPA conference in 2018, where I said as much. I said, Australia, it's the dawn of a new era. I think financial advisors are, on the whole, very professional, but that does not mean that there still isn't a tendency for folks to swim outside of their lane a little bit. And so working with a firm such as mine, I'm able to point people in the right direction. The other primary benefit is to do with the body. Now, many, many reasonable planners in Australia, and some of the top planners, I think, are exempt from this comment, but the body of knowledge, the sophistication around retirement income planning, I think is somewhat more advanced in the US. This is where the majority of the research is coming from. And I say that with a lot of respect. There's some great organizations and institutions in Australia. Griffith is a really good one. Deakin is another. But the center of gravity for research and the sophistication of the models and the technology for what you're able to do to model out how someone is going to turn their portfolio into a paycheck is somewhat more sophisticated here. And then, as you heard me say earlier, just the cost structure. In that Morningstar study that I was referring to, so the US, the average median, same thing there. The median expense ratio for a balanced fund was literally 40 basis points less. That's 0.4% less in the US for the same thing. When you compound out what difference that makes to returns over a 20-year period, you're talking about tens of thousands of dollars, on a portfolio. And that's not the full story. The Morningstar, as I alluded to earlier, they had to control various factors for their study. So in Australia, you pay platform fees. A platform fee, that's money, typically about 0.4%, you're paying to the broker just for the privilege of having your money sitting there.
That's changing a little bit because of some of the disasters we've had here. But isn't there a difference in the security of some of the superannuation assets, particularly compared to what the security of a pension fund in the States?
That's such a good question.
Can't the pension funds just disappear in a bankruptcy in the state?
Yeah, there's this fig leaf coverage for it, but we've got to be careful about the word pension, because in the US, it's a lot like the word liberal. It can mean totally different things.
Yeah.
So a pension if you use the word pension in the US, that refers specifically to someone who has worked for a company for 20 years and they're going to pay them an income stream for the rest of their life at retirement. It's a defined benefit. Whereas in British usage, in Australian usage, a pension really means the same thing as your super account. But anyway, that's...
Although we have pensions here and superannuation income streams, and they're vastly different. And that's what I mean about the security. There are certain superannuation assets that are pretty well secure,
protected,
but what you would call a pension fund in the US is generally speculative, unless it's employer based and they hold the assets. But in a bankruptcy, it disappears.
It almost disappears. That was the reference to the fig leaf from earlier, and that is, there is a government organisation. They take a small premium payment from the pension fund, and that organisation is called the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. Now, it's all in how you define the word guarantee, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I think Aussies mean it ain't going anywhere. Well, that doesn't quite mean that with a pension benefit guarantee. I've got a client. He worked for United Airlines, and when pensions began to go out of fashion in the 80s and 90s, they got rid of their pension. It might have been the result of a bankruptcy, but it was about the early 2000s, and his pension got drastically
cents in the dollar.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. So you do.
That happened to all the auto workers too.
That's right. Yeah, they got shafted. Yeah, GM's bankruptcy. Yeah, that took care of them. So you do need, and that is, and that's another service that we provide, because we know that. It's funny, the things and it's just kind of baked into your operating system. You're not even aware that you know it. But Grant, that's a good point. We do keep our eyes on the funding ratios of pensions for our clients, because they're going to be looking at a very different situation if that pension goes bust.
Do you think you have a different attitude to the whole financial industry because you've got a background in Australia, and as you were telling us off air, a family background that is European?
Absolutely. And that just comes about, it's like anyone, we're the sum result of the experiences that we've lived, and you get to see that what certain advisors in the US take for granted, you realize that's just not a constant globally. Things can be quite different from one country to another. Yeah. The best example of that is probably in the US, there's this almost religious divide between financial advisors that take a commission. They're called so-called fee-based, or commission-based would be a more direct way of saying it, and fee-only. And there's a halo that sits above the fee-only advisor's head, because in theory they're free of conflicts and they're holier than thou. I became a fee-only advisor to reduce the conflicts, and it's just simpler to explain when working with a new client. But I was fee-based for a couple of years, and I can honestly tell you that I became more of an advocate for getting the appropriate life and income protection when I was fee-only, when I had nothing to gain from the recommendation, from when I was taking commissions as well. Now, in Australia, there's practically no one. There's a tiny, tiny little industry organization, and they changed their name a few years ago, so I don't recall it off the top of my head. But the definition of independent in Australia is actually legally protected for financial advisors, and I think it's they've gone too far with it. It's you basically need to be fee only. You can't have any affiliation with any companies whatsoever, and nothing is no fixed commissions of any kind. But in Australia, they don't think twice about doing so-called risk advice. Which is the dividing line here. Like, if you do risk advice, the only way it gets paid in the US is by commission. Therefore, you are not a fee-only advisor. And in Australia, and I agree with the Australian stance, it's only proper planning. It's only proper risk management planning for you to look at, what would happen if you were to pass away prematurely and, leave your young family in a pickle. What would happen if you got cancer, as my mother did, and passed away early? What would happen?
Me too.
Oh, yeah. Actually, he had a 16-kilogram tumor removed from his stomach. Grant
Oh, my goodness.
survived the operation. And
from my kidney, and that took my kidney
16
too.
kilograms, big like a basketball.
Holy mackerel! Well, I'm glad you're here now, Grant. The point, I don't know if
that stuff happens, and people need to be aware of stuff happening.
And it doesn't. I'm like I said before. The way I work with clients is I certainly don't operate by fear, but good things happen to bad people, and it's only prudent management to take care of that. And don't we all agree in the past month? Who hasn't counted their blessings that they've got an emergency fund? Or think about what would happen. Hey, if this got me, where would that leave the rest of my family? Probability of anyone under the age of 50 dying is incredibly low, even in the coronavirus times, incredibly low. But that's not to say it's impossible.
It happens.
It still happens.
This might be an epiphany, this podcast, for a number of Americans living in Australia. And if it is their wake-up call and they're a bit behind in their affairs, how do they reach out to you? And what do they need to consider if they've been a little lax on their reporting requirements?
I'll take the first question first. So the best way would be to go to our website. Arete is the name of my firm, Arete Wealth Strategists Australia. URL for that website address is arete-wa.com, so wealthaustralia.com. And then we've got a contact form there. So I knew that was the right way to contact you guys, was to follow the proper channels and not try and track down an email address or phone number somewhere else. So that would be the way to contact us. And then, David, forgive me, I forget this. Yes, getting compliance with
if they've been slack, actually, if they've been a little lax.
So here's the way I would explain that is I think that coming forward looks good. You may possibly get hit for penalties, but if you come forward and it's clear that this is not willful non-compliance, then the IRS plays nicely. But if they find assets in Vanuatu and Switzerland and Singapore, then that's when they bring down the hammer. And it's also worth mentioning, every now and again, I think we might be towards the end of them because they've been running on and off for about a decade now, David. They have these things called OVDPs, offshore voluntary disclosure programs, and they're windows of time, typically a year. And earlier on, they ran for a couple of years, and there will be these safe harbor periods where you're able to come forward and declare an asset, and they will cap the penalties or whatever that they're going to impose at that period. But rare benevolence there. Exactly.
The cynic in me says they're the periods that they decide to implement this just before they go public with the senators and the famous entertainers that they've caught up with.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah, and I can say that.
They reach out to you, Ashley. Now, do they have to have a team or a contact point in Australia to liaise with you? Or do you give them somebody in Australia who's a trusted partner?
I would give one, and anyone reaching out, I'm quite happy to provide a referral. They don't have to be a client of mine. I could say, here's a good advisor, and I think they do good, honest work. But I wanted to go back to your previous question just for a moment, Dave, a very brief moment, and I'd say, another cultural dividing line between Australia and the US, and it is what it is, no judgment, it just is what it is Australia, I would say, is a country set up, and you can see it in so many different aspects of the culture, set up to be fair. if you want to fill out your tax return, you don't have to pay H&R Block or TurboTax their fee to do it. The ATO's got a half-decent program, and you can do it yourself. If your return's extra complicated and you don't care to get involved in taxes, then you can have your CPA do it. The US is not set up like that. In fact, there was a brouhaha, it must have been about a year ago now, where Intuit, the owner of TurboTax, and H&R Block are found to be lobbying to support a bill such that the IRS can never produce its own software. So that's right. So they're actively lobbying for it to be only a paid service that private companies provide. And that's very much in accordance with the American kind of ethos of let private companies do business, deal with business. And the same applies, this is a very long-winded way of saying, the same thing applies in the professional services domain. If you want to do something yourself, if you're that businessman who's a bit behind and has accounts he needs to disclose, then you would do well to have a professional team supporting you, telling you, here are what the rules are. And because the IRS is again, unlike Australia, they don't make a tremendous effort to communicate what the rules even are. So I work with professionals who do precisely that. And I would bring in a tax attorney or whoever was the appropriate party given the particular situation and really try and get that client the best outcome.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Ashley, it's been great talking. Grant, you got anything else you want to ask Ashley?
Look, I just want to ask something flippant.
That wouldn't be you, Grant, without a podcast.
No. Actually, a dual citizen American residing in Australia, if our detergent and disinfectant professor president that you've got over there, if when he ceased being the nation's scientific advisor, brought in conscription again, an American citizen living here is not beyond the reach of the call up to the armed forces. Would that be right?
Wow. Now that you take the cake, Grant. I have never been asked that question. Would an American still be conscripted? Well, keep in mind they would have to be of military age. And I think it's the late 30s that it cuts out. It's like 37 or 38, something like that it cuts out. I honestly don't know. I don't know.
That's one of the great mysteries that we'll just have to leave hanging out there. Like, does injecting UV light into your lungs fix coronavirus? There's been really some amazing things posited lately from the lectern at the White House. So
yes, very interesting.
Yes, so good luck with all of that over there. By the way,
Yep. We'll get through it eventually. It might cost us trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands
of people.
Yep, but
hey. Someone's just left a comment. Let's have a look. I've got to have a look at that.
What does it say, Grant? Read it out.
Good morning, more power. So I guess that means more power to you, Ashley. Good on you.
Right.
I don't understand a lot of American sayings like that.
Power. He's saying more nuclear, more coal power. That's what we need.
More coal power. That's it.
Yeah.
Actually, no. Time, mate. Thank you for coming. Thank you for appearing on the show.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I appreciate you accepting and responding to my outreach. It's been great. Been great chatting with you guys.
And anytime you think that there's something that we need to convey, feel free to push it out to us, Ashley.
Sounds good.
And don't lose that accent.
It comes back stronger when I'm talking to fellow Aussies.
Good on you, mate.
Good on ya. Yeah. All right. Catch you guys later.
Ciao, ciao.
Hooroo. What's coming up in the David Brongiorno world in the next week? People still coming in and wanting to migrate?
We're getting people. Basically, people who are here want to still stay here. And that's the story. People who are here will do anything to stay here within reason. And there are provisions to keep people here. So long as they hold a visa and are eligible for another visa, they can stay. A lot of people here are on holiday. They want to stay. They can't come back. They're locked out of their home country. We can make application for another tourist visa. I tell you what it does do. It forces the hand on a lot of couples. A lot of couples, somebody's come out, say, stateside, using Ashley's and our US podcast just then as an example. They come to visit their loved one. This is motivation for them to focus and determine whether they want to pursue the partner visa onshore, because if they go back, they leave, we don't know how long they're going to be locked out for. Does that make sense?
It does. We're lucky, aren't we, David, that we can continue to operate.
We're very lucky. We're very lucky.
You know, as using the technology that we've got, it's a different way, but we can still do it. But you can't build a house from your lounge room.
No, very hard. And
you can't make a road from
No.
So these industries are still being allowed to go on, but if we don't find a way to sort of, we're containing it well here in Australia. But if that situation changes, I don't know what is next, because we're all puddling along with so little business activity going on that the temptation's going to have to be there to try and go back to normal. And I think going back to normal means, there he goes, he got his elbow, well done.
In my elbow, very conscious of the elbow.
You know, going back to normal means people die. I mean, the death rates in Australia are very, very, very low, and we're extremely fortunate. You know,
hearts go out. Both our hearts go out, of course, to international students, though, because they're missing out on everything. We're seeing some encouraging press, some very benevolent, very kind restaurateurs opening food kitchens, soup kitchens. Ben Shrewy from Attica was reported in the paper yesterday doing 100. I don't know if it's 100 litres a week or 100 litres a day. And the bread, I mean, you know, if you have to go to a soup kitchen, imagine going to Ben Shrewy, having him make you potato leek soup and bread. That one of the greatest chefs on the planet cooking for you. I mean, he's looking after people. A lot of other restaurateurs are looking after their staff, but it's still...
That can only last for so long.
So long.
That's the difficulty. We're pushing the crash further away. I mean, look, you know, we both share this concern for what's going to happen to international students.
Well, there are building blocks through our economy. International students do the important jobs that Australians don't want to do.
Yep. And we've built an economy on their backs in two ways. The service jobs, the hospitality jobs.
They work with great vigour and passion, and we're much poorer for not having them.
And apart from the simple fact that, you know, depending on which metric you look at, it's our third or fourth largest industry in the country.
The figure fluctuates wildly, but it's, I mean, 60 billion.
Yeah, it depends how they measure it.
How it's quantified. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. If you add on the income that international students earn in Australia and the taxation raised from that, it's a massive industry. Yeah. So let's all not be so down in the dumps.
This week we'll bring some guests on and we'll talk about their experiences in Australia and how they're coping with coronavirus. But let's get I've got some people lined up. So off the coronavirus and off with some positive stories about migrants who flourished in Australia.
And of course, I've still got a couple of those queued up, David. So we've still got Grace and Nikechi and Misa, and there's some others.
People listening. There's some fabulous podcasts coming up. And Grace is a force of nature. She's an attorney from France, and she's a qualified dance instructor. She's great. Misa's great. Nikechi. We've got some fabulous women coming up. Great listen.
But of course, we're trying to just keep up with what's going on. Any changes that we get, and look, Ashley was great reaching out with something that neither of us would have probably thought about, because it's just not in our sort of sphere of vision.
Ashley was fantastic. I'm glad he did reach out, because there is a diaspora, and those Americans who live here need to be cognizant of their obligations, strictly enforced obligations, back stateside.
Of course, I'll put Ashley's contact information in the show notes. And
where can people listen to us again?
Well, they can listen to us on Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, all the pod places, everywhere. Reach out to us if you want to give us a hint about what we should be talking to, or if you want to tell us to dress up better on our on our live streams, or
shave more than once a week.
Yeah, or put some pants on.
Not board shorts. We've got an engineering program coming up because a guy did reach out to us. Where was he from? The United Kingdom or the United States?
Oh,
I think
gee.
he's from the United Kingdom.
We haven't talked about that for a while. I think from the UK.
Yeah, and we'll do a dedicated engineer episode because there are engineers, and when the doors open again, we'll need engineers as we always do. So it's definitely something coming up on the podcast.
And to continue our international student flavour, I've reached out to a number of the universities and student groups and just waiting for someone to come back and say, oh, yes, I'm happy to get my mug on the live stream and talk about it. But I think there's a real reluctance for a lot of the institutions to speak because...
Yeah. There is.
Because from what I'm being told privately, a lot of what they would want to say is in direct conflict to the way the government has so far handled it. And I think people want more done. And if they speak out and say something that might not be in the same yeah,
absolutely.
It just is not beneficial to any of that behind the scenes work that might be going on. So I completely understand that. I know a lot of people are still very confused about what an international student can and can't do. We're going to have to talk about things like rent relief and whatnot for everybody. But let's hope that it improves rather than slides down. Please remember.
Where do we listen, Grant? Spotify, Apple Podcasts.
Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Podchaser, Castbox, Castro. Gee, there's just too many to mention. Thanks, mate. Thanks everyone for paying attention. And it was good. We got a comment, and catch up with David on Twitter if you've got a query, and of course feedback, a review or a comment or whatever on any of the platforms. I get hold of that, and then David and I talk about them and respond. Ciao.
Ciao, mate.
And done.